So I'm Scott Peterson. I'm here to talk about open source and standards, but let me tell you a little bit my background so you understand the perspective I'm coming from. I'm a legal person. I come to it from that direction. I'm a patent attorney. I worked on general intellectual property matters for a long time, and then in the 1990s, I came across open source software and standards separately, and I was a legal lead at HP on those topics for 10 years. I then went to Google for 5 years where I focused entirely on standards. And now I have gone to Red Hat where I focus entirely, well, not entirely, almost entirely on open source. So I've been focused on open source and on standards things for a long time. So that's the perspective I come from, and I come from IT industry as I've described. So the first bit of background, in a sense, open source and standards, they are similar, right? We all know this. They have similarities. They are, of course, complementary, right? So we know that open source implementations have long been developed in association with specifications. Sometimes the implementations come first. Sometimes they're done together, right? They're complementary in that sense. The implementation experience informs what the specification should say. Increasingly, we're hearing people talk about them as alternatives, right? So you can get interoperability by having shared implementations that are done in open source projects. You can get interoperability through a specification, and then you have implementations that are done in different ways. So they are frequently now seen as alternatives. And of course, software plays a variety of other roles relative to specifications. Test suites to make sure that we can determine that people's implementations conform to tests, and other kinds of software that facilitates the use of specifications. So specifications and implementations built in open source projects, they relate to each other in a number of different ways. So they are similar, but they are different, and they are different in important ways. So the first and most important point actually in the entire talk for me is the very first bullet. And that is that open source software development and standards development are not 2 points on a spectrum of collaboration. So they are both kinds of mechanisms by which companies collaborate on technology development, but they are not these points that you can move around and mix and match. They're really very different. They have a lot of commonality, but the extent to which they are different is often overlooked, and sometimes people talk about one, oh, can't we just do that and the other? Anyway, so let me talk more about that. So rather than seeing these as something that you want to do as a hybrid, we want to, I think, understand open source and how it is a way of developing software, and the role that specifications can play and where their strengths are and their weaknesses, and figure out how to best use those two together, not to try to figure out how to make one like the other, okay? The exercise is not to make them the same. The exercise is to figure out how to make them work best together. And so here, let me just offer at the bottom some examples to back up my assertion. I just made the assertion that they're fundamentally different. We could spend another 20 minutes on this slide. So first off, of course, standards are specifications. Open source projects give you implementations. And we could talk about that for a long time. Open source projects are organized as a form of continuous development. You can try to structure that into targeted releases, but it's still fundamentally, open source projects are continuous development. Specifications development is very version driven. There's a scoping, an expectation of what you're going to do. You work to that, and you make a snapshot, and that snapshot is hard for some period of time. That difference is far more significant than you might think. I wrote a bit on that about how that affects how you might think about patent treatment. And then finally, for governance, the governance of those two things is more different than you might think. So in part because of the ability to fork an open source project, you can afford a much more casual approach to governance than you can with a standards project, where governance perhaps is a more important thing. So, okay, so last slide. I only had 3 slides. Okay, so why is open source important? It's not because it's a bunch of cool licenses. It's important because it's turned out to be a remarkable way to build software. I mean, that is the reason why everybody is interested in it. It's a remarkable way to build software, okay? So, but what is it that results in this remarkable effect? That's what the middle of the slide here is about. It is completely non-obvious. I mean, this is where I've been around this. So somebody asked me about this thing called the GNU General Public License in 1992. So I've been watching this space for a long time. And I don't know why these combinations of things work exactly. I could have my own theory and speculation, but that doesn't matter. We can observe over the last 20 to 30 years that with this set of rules, the result is an amazing effectiveness in building software, and not just small projects, but amazingly complex things can get done. It is not obvious why that is. In any case, the factors that contribute to this are pretty simple. The ongoing work product is visible to everyone. This is an important feature. I really take this to heart. You say, well, we know who's going to contribute and we can keep it secret here. Yeah, I think you may underestimate the value that is obtained by that. The ongoing work product is visible to everyone. There is a broad openness of participation. The threshold for contributing to an open source project is stunningly low. So in the 1990s, I did the legal work for joint development agreements. So in the 90s, big computer companies collaborated on software just like they do now. Well, not just like. They did it there with these incredibly heavyweight legal tools. I would work for months and months on these 40-page long documents that describe all the things that could happen and how you would divvy up the rights if this happened and that happened. And instead, that same work is done vastly more effectively with essentially no rules. That is a really important realization. So broad openness of participation, you don't have all this elaborate documentation, and the IP rules, these are not fancy, elaborate rules where we're going to figure out, let's see, who owned this part, and the people that worked on this part, then they have some rights to that, and then, but if we go south on this thing on Tuesday, then we're going to have some special rights that'll emerge. No. I wrote a ton of documents like that, and I, in retrospect, don't think they were nearly as effective as the simple things that we have today that are called open source licenses. Okay. Anyway, so the IP rules aren't these elaborate 1,000-page long things. They are, for software, open source software, you choose what to contribute. And if you contribute it with no strings attached. That's pretty darn simple. You're agreeing that if you've contributed, you are not expecting to then further extract some revenue from the thing you contributed. That's the IP rules, and it's pretty darn simple. So the message in sort of anecdote form, I just want to change it a little bit. I'm really familiar with these standards projects, and the open source works this way. Maybe if we just did this, or maybe if the open source project was tweaked in this way, I like it this way better. My lawyer is more comfortable. I think you need to be very, very cautious. Because, in fact, these features which have led to this effect, which is an amazing way to build software, they work in this combination. And you tweak them, and you no longer have quite the same thing. The implications are not are by no means trivial. So anyway, so that's my message. And now Mike.